The wind whispers tales of adventure and discovery, carrying with it the echoes of ancient voyages across the vast ocean. It's a story that has captivated generations, sparking dreams of exploration and reminding us of the indomitable spirit of those who dared to venture into the unknown. This is a story that begins on the shores of a bygone era where legends were born and destinies were shaped. Join me as we embark on a journey through time to uncover the secrets of a forgotten past. Our adventure begins on the 9th day of the 10th month, a date that stands as a testament to human curiosity and resilience. This is a day set aside to honor the memory of a legendary explorer, a man whose name echoed through the annals of history, Leif Erikson. Today, as the world prepares to commemorate Leif Erikson Day, we find ourselves transported to an era when the icy winds of the north carried more than just the chill of winter. They bore tales of distant lands and new horizons. The year is 1000 AD, and the setting sun paints the sky in hues of orange and purple as it dips below the horizon. In the heart of Scandinavia, nestled between the rugged fjords and the endless expanse of the sea, lies the bustling port of Stoby. Here, amidst the salty tang of the ocean and the laughter of sailors, there lived a man named Erik the Red. Erik was no ordinary man. His lineage could be traced back to the legendary Viking Ivar Boneless, a warrior whose deeds had become a thing of myth and legend. But unlike his ancestors, Erik's heart didn't yearn for battles and conquests. His soul was stirred by the call of the open sea, the allure of the unknown. He dreamed of exploring the vast ocean, discovering new lands, and charting unknown territories. And then one fateful day, as if the gods themselves had heard his unspoken desires, fate presented him with an opportunity that would change his life forever. A ship, the Yngvi, renowned for its speed and endurance, sat gracefully in the harbor, ready to set sail on a journey that promised both peril and intrigue. This was no ordinary voyage. It was a mission of exploration, a quest to discover the very edge of the known world. Erik's heart raced as he stood at the helm, the wind whipping through his hair, carrying with it the scent of adventure and the promise of the unknown. As the Yngvi set sail, it marked not just the beginning of a journey, but the start of a legacy that would echo through the ages. For Erik's son, Leif, was destined to follow in his father's footsteps and write his own name in the stars. But for now, as the Yngvi sailed towards the setting sun, the tale of Leif Erikson remained unwritten, waiting for the winds of fate to carry it across the seas. Fast forward a millennium, and the story has come full circle. Today, on this very day, October, we celebrate Leif Erikson Day, a tribute to the man who may have reached North America long before Columbus. In the tapestry of history, Leif Erikson stands as a beacon, guiding us through the mists of time to a past where bravery knew no bounds and exploration was a way of life. As the first European to set foot on continental United States, he opened a chapter in human history that would forever link the old world with the new. His legacy serves as a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge and the thirst for adventure are universal human traits that transcend time and geography. For Leif Erikson, the call of the unknown was a siren song that lured him across the vast expanse of the North Atlantic. Driven by an insatiable curiosity and an unwavering determination, he embarked on a journey that led him to the shores of a land far removed from the familiar landscapes of his homeland. And while the exact location of his landing remains shrouded in mystery, the impact of his voyage is undeniable. As we gather on this day to pay homage to Leif Erikson, let us be inspired by his indomitable spirit. Let us marvel at his courage in the face of the unknown and celebrate his contribution to our understanding of the world. For Leif Erikson is more than just a name in history books. He is a symbol of human potential, a testament to our ability to explore, discover, and connect across vast distances. In the grand tapestry of human achievement, Leif Erikson's story stands as a shining thread, weaving together the tales of discovery, bravery, and the relentless pursuit of knowledge. His legacy continues to resonate through the ages, reminding us that the spirit of exploration is an integral part of our collective heritage. As we reflect on his remarkable journey, let us also take a moment to appreciate the significance of this day. October, a day set aside to honor the memory of a great explorer. It is a day for us to pause, to remember and to celebrate the contributions of Leif Erikson to our understanding of the world. It is a day for educators to bring history to life, for students to learn about the brave souls who came before them, and for all of us to reflect on the importance of exploration and discovery. But as the night deepens and the stars begin to twinkle in the inky blackness above, it's time to share the stories of these extraordinary individuals who dared to dream beyond the horizon. Gather close and let me tell you about the man whose journey changed the course of history. Leif Erikson, the name echoes with the spirit of adventure. A true pioneer who dared to navigate the treacherous seas and discover new lands long before the age of exploration. Born in Iceland around the year 970 AD, Leif was no ordinary man. His bloodline was rich with the sagas of Viking heritage, tracing back to the legendary Ivar Boneless. Yet unlike many of his kin who found glory in battle and conquest, Leif's heart yearned for the mysteries that lay beyond the known world. As the son of Erik the Red, banished from Iceland for his fiery spirit, Leif grew up amidst tales of adventure and the allure of the untamed wilderness. It was during these formative years that his adventurous spirit was ignited, setting him on a path that would lead to greatness. Driven by an insatiable thirst for exploration, Leif set sail with a fleet of ships, venturing forth into the uncharted waters of the North Atlantic. His journey would take him to the shores of a land that would forever alter the course of history. And as the ships cut through the waves, the rhythmic crash of the oars against the water echoed the pounding of their hearts, a symphony of courage and determination. With each stroke, they drew closer to the unknown, propelled by the hope of discovery and the thrill of the chase. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows over the deck, the crew spotted a sight that sent a shiver of excitement down their spines. On the horizon, a faint glow, like a beacon in the fading light, beckoned to them, promising an end to their journey. With renewed vigor, they steered towards the glimmer, their eyes fixed on the prize. As the ship approached the shore, anticipation hung heavy in the air. Would this be the land of their dreams, a place where new beginnings awaited? With bated breath, they prepared to make landfall, knowing that they were on the cusp of something extraordinary. And as they stepped onto the sandy shores, they realized they were not just explorers, they were pioneers, about to etch their names in the annals of history. With each step inland, the explorers marveled at the wonders that unfolded before them, a land teeming with natural beauty and untouched wilderness. The dense forests whispered secrets of an ancient past, while the meandering rivers reflected the sky above. As they ventured deeper into this newfound paradise, the explorers couldn't shake off the feeling that they were not just discovering a new land, but forging a connection between two worlds. With every sunrise, the explorers delved deeper into the heart of this magnificent land, their senses overwhelmed by the sights, sounds, and sensations that surrounded them. The air was alive with the songs of exotic birds, the very essence of the forest itself. The explorers encountered not only natural wonders, but also the indigenous people who called this land home. Through gestures and trade, they began to piece together the stories of these native cultures, learning about their traditions, beliefs, and way of life. The explorers realized that they were not merely conquerors, but guests in a land that had its own rich history and vibrant inhabitants. Days turned into weeks as the explorers continued their journey of discovery, their thirst for knowledge unquenchable. They documented their findings, sketching the flora and fauna, recording their observations, and collecting artifacts that became tangible pieces of their adventure. Each discovery fueled their determination to explore further, driven by an insatiable curiosity about what else this land might reveal. The explorers faced their share of challenges, from navigating dense thickets to braving unpredictable weather. But with each obstacle they overcame, their camaraderie grew stronger. Bound together by their shared experiences and the realization that they were part of something truly special, the explorers' spirits soared as they realized the magnitude of their discovery. Word spread of the existence of this wondrous land, igniting a spark of wonder and excitement in the hearts of many. The explorers returned home, not just as adventurers, but as ambassadors of a new world, eager to share their tales and inspire others to embark on their own journeys of discovery. As we conclude our journey through Chapter 1, let us take a moment to appreciate the magic that unfolds when history comes to life. From the icy landscapes of Scandinavia to the shores of a distant land, we have witnessed the spirit of exploration that drives humanity forward. As the last page of this chapter turns, let us eagerly anticipate what lies ahead, for in the chapters yet to be written, we will continue to uncover the mysteries of Leif Erikson's legacy and the profound impact he had on the course of history. Until next time, may your own journeys be filled with the same sense of wonder, curiosity, and courage that guided Leif Erikson across the boundless seas. I want to express my deepest gratitude for joining me on this incredible journey through time. If you've enjoyed this installment, please don't hesitate to show your support by liking this video. Your support means the world to me, and it fuels my passion for bringing history to life for all of you. If you're eager to continue our journey through time, Simply click on the subscribe button and you'll never miss out on any of our captivating historical tales. Once again, thank you for being a part of our story. Until next time, keep exploring, keep discovering, and keep embracing the magic of history. Welcome back to another episode. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 2 of How to Be a Viking, the Norse world. Alright guys, so Chapter 2 is all about the world of the Vikings, right? But it's specifically about their world around the year 1000 AD. So when we talk about the Norse world, first thing we have to talk about is Norway, obviously where our boy Leroy is from. And then we also have to talk about Iceland and Greenland, because those are two other places that are super important for Norse culture. Norway in this time period was still very much a kingdom divided by mountains. This is why when you look at the map, the different regions of Norway don't really have like one big main city that unites them. They're kind of isolated from each other. The geography of Norway forces its people into small communities, which creates this sort of decentralized power structure within the realm. Another way to put it might be to say that the landscape makes it impossible to unite, mountains, fjords, lack of roads. So what ends up happening is that you have all these little communities, they become self-governing, right? They just do their own thing. And the way that they keep order in their communities is through something called the Thing, which is basically an assembly. So every summer there would be a big gathering where everybody from the community came together and they settled feuds. They made laws. They elected leaders. It was kind of like their government. Now these things were actually held in open air, kind of like a big festival with a lot of drinking going on. And it was also an opportunity for bards to get together and share stories about the glory of their people and their heroes. Okay, now while Norway was definitely a mountain, fjord, difficult to traverse kind of place, it had some major benefits. For one, the cold climate meant that there were lots of fish in the water, and since Vikings were big old seafarers, they could take advantage of that. The other thing that Norway had going for it was wood. They had tons of wood, which is great if you want to build stuff, especially if you want to build ships. Now when you think of Viking ships, longships are probably what come to mind, and you can bet that longships played a huge role in Viking society. But they weren't the only kind of ship that they had. In fact, depending on what you were doing, there were 3 or 4 different kinds of boats that you could use. First was the snekkja, which was a nice fast boat, good for trade or travel. Then you had the nar, which was a bigger transport boat, good for carrying cargo. And then you had the langskip, which was your classic longship, good for war or exploration. Now here's the interesting thing about ships and shipping in the Norse world. Even though there wasn't a ton of interaction between the different regions of Scandinavia due to the geography, they still managed to have a pretty robust trade network thanks to ships. That's kind of how they did it. Trade was based around a set of staple items. So in Norway, that would be fish. Fish was a huge part of their diet, so they would take all that fish that they caught, and they would trade it with other people for, I don't know, whatever they needed. But because Norway was so mountainous, they didn't really grow a ton of food. So they needed other people to do that for them. They needed farmers. That's where Iceland and Greenland came in. Iceland was sparsely populated, so they had lots of land and not enough people to use it. So what they would do is they would send ships over to Norway to pick up all this fish, and then they would bring that fish back to Iceland, trade it with the farmers for food, and then they would head back to Norway with the food. Same thing with Greenland. Now, in Greenland's case, it's a little bit different because they didn't actually discover it until after they discovered Iceland, but it's kind of the same idea. Use what you got to get what you need. Okay, now this whole time I've been describing the Norse world as a bunch of different regions that are coming together through trade. But there's also a pretty significant cultural element that ties them all together, and that is the love of a good story. I talked about this a little bit in my last video, but Norse culture was steeped in storytelling. I mean, remember, these people didn't have TV or anything like that. Their form of entertainment was listening to bards recite stories about heroes and gods and monsters. And even more importantly, those stories weren't just a form of entertainment. They were a way of transmitting knowledge, a way of preserving history, a way of shaping identity. So stories are kind of like the glue that holds the Norse world together. But okay, so let's get back to the topic of exploration. If you're a Viking living in Norway, you're out there on the water all the time. You're hauling cargo, you're fighting battles, you're traveling to different regions to participate in the thing. And the more time you spend on the ocean, the more you start to wonder what's out there. Like if you're sailing south from Norway, eventually the horizon just kind of disappears, right? What's down there? Is it just endless water? What if there's land? Or if you're sailing north, again, you're wondering what's up there. Is there more land? There's just all this curiosity about what's beyond the horizon. And that's not even mentioning the fact that Vikings were constantly in search of new resources, because remember, they weren't really growing food in Norway. They were relying on other people to do that for them. So if you're in Norway and you hear about all this awesome land that has fertile soil and is just waiting to be used, well, that's kind of a game changer, right? It's almost like the perfect combination of circumstances that push these guys to explore. Geography, technology, culture, incentive. Alright, so now we're going to meet the star of the show, our boy Leif Erikson. Leif is a legendary Viking explorer, the son of Erik the Red, who was himself a notorious Viking outlaw. So here's how it goes. Erik the Red gets exiled from Norway for, I don't know, doing Erik the Red things, and he heads over to Iceland to start a new life. But being Erik the Red, he quickly runs afoul of the law again, and he's forced to flee once again, this time to the desolate island of Greenland. Now, the name Greenland is a little misleading, I have to say. It's not like a lush, tropical paradise like we think of it today. No, Greenland was a frozen, windswept wasteland, totally inhospitable to human life, you know, unless you're a polar bear or something. But Erik the Red saw an opportunity here. He basically said, hey, everybody thinks this place sucks, but I'm gonna turn it into a Norse colony, and he did. Okay, maybe he didn't do it all by himself, but he was definitely the guy that made it happen. He settled the eastern coast of Greenland and started a farm. Now, while Greenland wasn't exactly known for its delicious produce, it was great for raising livestock, sheep, cows, goats, horses. So Erik the Red was able to build a pretty comfortable life for himself there. Also, just so you guys know, the name Greenland was actually a marketing ploy. Like he named it Greenland to attract settlers, so you could call him like a real estate agent, I guess. Anyway, Erik the Red's plan worked. People came to Greenland, and eventually there were two major settlements on the island, one in the east and one in the west. Erik the Red actually lived in the eastern settlement, which was called Erikstera, that literally translates to Erik's Stadium. Now, this is where Leif comes into the picture, because Leif was born in Greenland. His dad, Erik the Red, named the place after himself, but he didn't actually found it. That honor goes to a guy named Gunnbjorn Olfsson. So yeah, this is kind of a big deal, right? This whole notion that Leif Erikson discovered America is completely false. Like America was already occupied by indigenous people for thousands of years before Europeans showed up. But what is true is that Leif was one of the first non-indigenous people to set foot in North America. Anyway, that'll do it for Chapter 2. Next time we're gonna dive into Chapter 3, The Age of Outlaws, so get ready for that. Until then, so yeah, hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one. Welcome back to my channel. This is Chapter 3 of my series covering the adventures of Erik the Red and the establishment of the first European settlements in Greenland. You can find links to all the previous videos below. Let's dive right into it. After murdering two of his fellow jarls or nobles, Erik the Red was banished from Iceland and sentenced to 3 years of exile in Norway. Now, technically speaking, that sentence wasn't supposed to include Greenland, but when your name means red, it's not exactly hard to see where the wind is gonna blow. During his stay in Greenland, he saw an opportunity to make something of his life and maybe even carve out a small kingdom for himself. After all, he had some valuable assets, connections to the royal court in Norway, an extensive knowledge of the North Atlantic gained during years of travel, and finally, a large fleet of ships and a crew of experienced sailors. So after getting a papal bull granting him full authority to govern any land he chose to settle, Erik started to recruit people for his new colony. Since most of them were criminals, freemen who owed the king money or had been convicted of lesser crimes like insulting people of the church, let's just say that enthusiasm wasn't exactly high. So he made them a deal. Pay your debt, get passage to Greenland and start fresh. If you don't have any debts, you get to keep everything you have and get another shot at life. People agreed, and soon he had enough recruits to begin his work. He charted a course north, arriving off the coast of Greenland in the year 982. He spent the summer exploring the area, searching for some place with decent soil and timber, as well as some place that could support a small settlement. While doing so, he named the southern part of the island Garda, meaning garden, because of the lush green vegetation, and the northern part, which was mostly covered in ice, he called Astri by land, or Eastern Settlement. With the scouting done, he set up shop in Eastern Settlement and started building houses and farms. Before long, a total of 5 farm complexes were established, each built near a natural harbor with plenty of grass for livestock and firewood nearby. They also found wild fruit growing there, along with many different types of fish, so everything seemed perfect until winter arrived. First, the cold was intense, dark and damp. There was no wood heating available, because they had chopped down every tree to build their houses. And finally, food was scarce since nothing grew there during the winter months, so everyone was forced to subsist on dried fish and meat. But this turned out to be a bad idea, because after storing their food properly, the rodents got into it and contaminated much of their supplies. When spring finally arrived, only half of the men survived. These included Erik the Red, who quickly set about fixing the many problems that had led to the deaths of his colonists. To fix the issue of insufficient housing, he improved their homes by digging deep pits under the floors and filling them with hot stones heated over their fires. By placing those rocks beneath their floors, their homes stayed warm and cozy throughout the winter. Next, he sent a message back to Iceland requesting timber, livestock and food. Finally, he hired a few hunters to capture more animals for food, and to ensure the community would never go hungry again, he employed people to hunt, fish and gather food all year round. As Erik worked to improve the lives of his settlers, his reputation spread through the North Atlantic, attracting new settlers to come and join him. More and more people did just that, but he still faced difficulties. For instance, the coast of Greenland was treacherous with giant sand dunes, huge cliffs and shallow waters, so building harbors and bringing in large vessels was incredibly difficult. Add in vicious storms, freezing temperatures and attacks by outside raiders, and you have yourself a real challenge. Still, Erik persevered, managing to establish another 4 farm complexes along the ice-jammed coast. He then returned to Norway to get more settlers, but found himself summoned to the royal court. King Haakon had received complaints from Icelanders about how Erik was tricking them into going to Greenland by claiming it was fertile and rich with game when in fact, the entire island was frozen and desolate. Now normally, you'd think that Erik the Red would have immediately gone into full-on defend myself mode, but instead, he decided to double down. He described in great detail how amazing the land was and how he had already made it a very profitable trading center for the people of Iceland. In fact, he claimed that it was so wealthy and so close to the North American continent, which he had personally explored, that it was ripe for the taking by King Haakon. Well, that was probably one hell of a sales pitch because the king was so impressed that he bestowed upon Erik the title of Earl and granted him tax breaks and protection from any rival Norwegian kings. But unfortunately, when Erik returned to Greenland, he found it devastated. The other Jarls had seized his lands, driven away his people and destroyed his farms. Erik went straight into action and raised an army, quickly defeating the other Jarls and reclaiming what was rightfully his. But realizing that the island itself was not big enough to sustain the growing number of settlers, and that he had little power over the Norwegian king, Erik packed up and headed west to explore more land. Before leaving, he appointed his son Leif as ruler of Greenland, instructed him to keep the peace and reminded him of his own mistakes while ruling. Then Erik sailed off into the sunset, giving Leif the opportunity to write his own story. But hold up, we're not done yet. Don't forget that if you want to learn more about Norse history, you can check out our website. We've got loads of articles covering everything from the legendary battles of Ragnar Lothbrok to the life of Queen Margaret Ive. Plus, we've got exclusive content you won't find anywhere else. And if that isn't enough, we also release 2 new videos every week on our channel, so there are plenty of ways to get your Viking fix. Speaking of which, I haven't told you anything about the main topic of this chapter yet. That's right. It's time to talk about the second greatest Viking, Leif Erikson. Yes, the guy whose name inspired me to grow my hair. He took over Greenland at the age of 20 and ruled for 17 years before passing the job on to his son Amund during his reign. He focused on maintaining the peace his father had established and making sure that Greenland remained a part of the Norwegian kingdom. In fact, he became so successful at it that he was able to send embassies to foreign courts, such as the court of King Ethelstan of England, establishing diplomatic relations between the 2 kingdoms. With everything seemingly peachy keen in Greenland, why did he decide to head west? Well, he didn't really. You see, he had a half-brother named Thorvaldr who had a taste for adventure and convinced Leif to let him sail west to see what was out there. Leif reluctantly agreed, but warned him that if he caused any trouble, he'd cut off his balls. So Thorvaldr and his crew set sail, but soon ran into a violent storm that drove them far off course. When they finally arrived inland, They found themselves on a rocky, barren island with no trees, no grass, and barely any wildlife. To top it off, the weather was horrible, so they quickly set sail and headed back home. Upon returning to Greenland, Thorvaldr shared tales of his travels with anyone who would listen, but it was too fantastic to be believed, so nobody paid it any mind. That is, until Leif heard it for himself. Now, as a dutiful ruler, Leif knew he should ignore it. After all, his father had tried and failed to claim any land west of Greenland, and he wasn't about to try and follow in his father's footsteps. Still, the thought of exploration and adventure tugged at his heartstrings. You see, Erik the Red had instilled in Leif and his siblings a love of the sea and the thrill of discovery. When Erik would return from his journeys, he would regale them with stories of faraway lands and daring adventures, and as they grew older, Leif and his siblings would join him on his voyages. Experiencing firsthand the wonders of the North Atlantic, they would sail for weeks on end, navigating by the stars and the sun, always on the lookout for new and exciting places to explore. They discovered remote bays and hidden coves filled with wildlife and lush vegetation, far removed from the icy wastelands of their homeland, and they learned to survive in the harshest of conditions, enduring freezing temperatures, violent storms, and dwindling supplies. Through it all, Erik encouraged their adventurous spirit, teaching them how to navigate by the stars, how to hunt and fish in uncharted waters, and most importantly, how to persevere in the face of adversity. And as Leif grew older, he began to feel the call of the sea, the same call that had driven his father and his forefathers before him. He knew that his destiny lay beyond the familiar shores of Greenland, that he was meant to explore the unknown and push the boundaries of their world. So despite his responsibilities as ruler, Leif couldn't resist the urge to set sail and discover what lay beyond the horizon. He knew that his journey would be fraught with danger, but he was also aware that it was a journey he had to take. It was in his blood, in his bones, and in his very soul. And so, with a heavy heart but a determined spirit, Leif Erikson set sail for the unknown, hoping to make his father proud and carve his own name in the annals of Viking history. Thanks for watching. Alright, so Chapter 4, let's do it. Leif Erikson, the young explorer. Around the year 960 AD, a young boy was born in the remote settlement of Brattahala in Greenland. His name was Leif. He had a good childhood, or at least a normal one for the time and place. His father, Erik the Red, was a notorious murderer, and had been exiled to Greenland from Iceland after killing a large number of people in a fit of rage. And his mother, Thyra, was a devout Christian who had converted to the faith after she'd been taken captive by Vikings on one of their pillaging raids. She taught Leif about Jesus Christ and the hope of salvation through him. She told him about her captivity and how she'd been forced to serve the gods of the Vikings, but refused to take part in the pagan rituals. She also told him of her conversion when a priest had come to Greenland to tell them about God, the one true God, and how all the other gods were demons. Now, as a boy, Leif would sit by the fire listening intently, while his mother spun these yarns about heroic chieftains and daring adventures, as well as stories of far-off lands like the mythical Vinland, a land full of wild grapes. In fact, his father, Erik the Red, had once sailed there and had said it was real. Erik had gone there with a fleet of ships filled with men, but they'd all died except Erik and two others, who barely managed to escape with their lives. It was a shame. They'd gone there because they believed that the land of Vinland was rich in precious metals and other riches, but unfortunately, they hadn't found any. And even worse, the native inhabitants had killed most of their men. So Erik the Red had called the natives Skrallings, which literally means the worthless ones. But Leif heard all these stories, and his imagination ran wild with the possibilities. He wanted to explore and discover new lands, just like his father had done. But his father wasn't really keen on him going out exploring. He'd seen what had happened to him, and he didn't want the same thing to happen to his son. But Leif was restless, and he wanted more than just life in a small settlement in Greenland. He wanted adventure. He wanted excitement. He wanted to see the world. And one day he decided to follow his dreams and set sail for Norway. When he got there, he met King Olaf Tryggvason, who became fond of the young man and took him under his wing. You see, Olaf was a Christian too, and he was trying to convert all the Norsemen to Christianity. He wanted them to abandon their old ways and become followers of Jesus. Now, Leif had been raised as a Christian, and so he, too, wanted the Norsemen to turn away from their old beliefs and put their trust in God. So the two of them saw eye to eye on this issue, and Olaf decided to make Leif his godson. He also gave him a royal ship and allowed him to keep anything he found on his voyages, so long as it was brought back to Norway. So Leif was very happy. He thanked the king profusely and set sail for the sea. He went to the Faroe Islands first, and then he went to Iceland, where he did some trading. He bought a lot of sheep, cattle, and horses, and then he took all these animals back to Norway for King Olaf. But all the time, Leif kept thinking about the stories his mother used to tell him about the far-off land of Vinland, the land of the wild grapes. He wanted to go there so badly, but he knew that if he did, he might not come back alive. You see, his father had told him scary stories about the native inhabitants, the Skrallings who supposedly lived there. They were fierce warriors, his father had said, and they wouldn't think twice about killing anyone who set foot on their shores. But Leif couldn't help but feel that something was calling him to Vinland. He felt like God was telling him to go there, and so he decided to ignore his father's warning and set sail for the new world. It was a long and perilous journey, but eventually they spotted land. They were so happy, they cheered and shouted for joy and sailed right into the harbor. Now, when they first landed in Vinland, it seemed like a paradise. There were lush green fields and tall thick forests and sparkling rivers, and they could hear the sweet sound of birds singing in the trees. It was beautiful. But as they explored further, they realized that this paradise was not all that it seemed, for deep in the forest, they heard the Skrallings shouting and making a lot of noise, and they knew that they were being watched. And sure enough, soon they came face to face with the natives. Now, the Skrallings weren't exactly what Leif had pictured. They weren't huge, hairy beasts, but they were definitely fierce. They had sharp eyes and strong, muscular bodies, and they carried weapons made of stone and bone. Leif knew that he was in trouble, but he wasn't scared. He'd been trained by his father to be a warrior, and he knew how to fight. And so he stood his ground and shouted back at the Skrallings in his best imitation of their language. Somehow this startled them, and they slowly lowered their weapons and backed away. Then one of them stepped forward and said something to the others, and they all turned and walked into the forest. Leif and his men watched them go, and then they, too, walked away. So Leif had survived his first encounter with the Skrallings, but he knew that he couldn't stay in Vinland much longer. He had to get back to Norway. As quickly as they'd arrived, Leif and his crew set sail and headed back to Norway. When he got there, he told the king all about his adventures, but he didn't mention the Skrallings. He didn't want to scare away any potential settlers, and besides, he had something else on his mind. You see, since becoming King Olaf's godson, Leif had become very close to the royal family, and he'd fallen in love with the king's daughter, a beautiful young woman named Thyra. But when Olaf found out that Leif was a heathen, he forbade them from seeing each other, and that's when Leif decided to leave Norway and return to Greenland. Once there, he began preparing for his next voyage. He wanted to go back to Vinland, but this time he wanted to stay there. He wanted to explore more of the island and maybe even settle there himself. But his father, Erik the Red, begged him not to go. He told Leif about all the dangers that lay in wait for him in Vinland, and he warned him that the Skrallings were only one of the problems. But Leif wouldn't listen. He was determined to go back to Vinland no matter what. In the end, he got his way, and he set sail for the new world once again. This time, though, he took his whole family with him. He wanted them to see the wonders of Vinland for themselves, and maybe they could start a new life there, a life free from the troubles of Norway and Greenland. Little did he know that this voyage would change history forever. Alright, so what do you think? What do you think of Leif? Do you think he'll succeed in his mission to explore Vinland? Let me know in the comments below. And while you're down there, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Also, alright, so thanks for watching. Thanks for joining us here on our channel as we continue to bring you new episodes every week. Remember, if you want to support the channel, you can do so through the links in the description. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye. The year is 999 AD. A young man named Leif Erikson stands on the coast of his native Iceland. In front of him stretches the mighty Atlantic Ocean, an endless expanse of churning water that has captivated the minds of men since time began. But it's not the vastness of the sea that captures Leif's attention today. He's listening intently to a sailor just back from a voyage to the west, a land beyond the familiar shores of Iceland and Norway. You see, in the late 900s, as Viking exploration reached its peak, stories began circulating among sailors and traders of mysterious lands that lay west of the known world. Some said these new shores were rich in forests and meadows, while others claimed they were inhabited by people with pale skin and even stranger customs. And although no one had ever set foot on this fabled Vinland, the very suggestion that there might be new lands out there captured the imagination of many Vikings, including Leif. One day, a seasoned traveler named Bjarni returned to Iceland after a journey to the west that he hoped would bring him fame and fortune. Instead, he found himself the center of a different kind of attention. See, when Bjarni set sail for the west, his goal wasn't to discover new lands, but simply to trade in the established areas where other Norsemen had forged settlements. Places like the Faroe Islands and the Isle of Man, both of which were located well west of Iceland. But as fate would have it, a violent storm blew Bjarni way off course. For weeks, he and his crew battled the wrath of the ocean until finally, when their provisions were low and their hope even lower, they spotted land. Overjoyed, they set course for the welcoming shores, eager to make their way to safety. But as they sailed closer, a strange sight met their eyes. They had never seen this land before. Its mountains, valleys, and coastline were utterly unfamiliar. Bjarni and his men had stumbled upon a place that no Norseman had ever laid eyes on, somewhere far beyond the known world. Though exhausted and starving, Bjarni knew he had to choose between two terrible options. He could either turn back and face the near certainty of starvation, or press on into the unknown, risking everything on the chance that this new land might hold the promise of survival. He chose the latter, and much to his relief, soon discovered signs of life on the island. Bjarni's men quickly came across a river teeming with fish. So plentiful were the fish that they could easily be taken by hand. After making themselves a fire, Bjarni and his crew feasted on the fresh catch and rested for the night. The following morning, they explored further and soon realized that they had found an earthly paradise. As far as they could see, the land was uninhabited, filled with deep forests, wide open fields and gushing rivers. It was everything they had heard in the fantastical tales of Vinland. Yet, despite its beauty, Bjarni knew that he and his men could not stay here. He had neither supplies nor the means to build shelter in this strange and potentially dangerous land. So with heavy hearts, they left this idyllic place as quickly as they had found it, sailing back to Iceland without setting foot on solid ground or speaking a word to any potential inhabitants. Now, though Bjarni's discovery went unknown, he had become the first European in recorded history to set foot in North America, nearly 500 years before Christopher Columbus would arrive. Upon returning to Iceland, Bjarni told his tale to anyone who would listen. Many dismissed his story as nothing more than wishful thinking, while others believed every word. But perhaps the most affected by Bjorn's tale was a young man named Leif Erikson. As I mentioned earlier, Leif was the son of Erik the Red, one of the most famous Vikings of all time. You see, Erik the Red was a notorious warrior and murderer who had been banished from Norway for killing a fellow chieftain in a fit of rage. He eventually settled in Iceland, where he sired 2 sons, the elder of whom was named Leif. Leif had always been fascinated by the tales of adventure and discovery that his father brought home from his travels. But it was Bjarni's story that truly captured his imagination. The idea of a new land filled with untold riches and adventures was like a fire that had been lit in Leif's soul. He felt a burning desire to explore this Vinland for himself, to see if the stories were true and to claim this land for himself and his people. But he knew that he couldn't just set sail without preparation. First, he needed to secure the support of his people and gather the resources he would need for such a long and dangerous journey. So Leif set about his task with a single-minded determination. He traveled around Iceland, rallying support for his voyage and gathering supplies, food, tools and materials for building ships. All the while he carefully observed the stars and studied the currents and winds, planning his route to the mysterious Vinland. Finally, when everything was in order, Leif gathered his men, gave them a rousing speech about the glory and fortune that awaited them, and set sail for the west. "Hey guys, thanks for joining me on this episode of Vikings," explained. If you're excited to hear about Leif Erikson's amazing discovery of Vinland, then let me know by liking this video and subscribing so you never miss an exciting episode. I'm also on social media, so come say hi. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. In the year 973, Erik the Red, having made repeated trips to the desolate yet resource-rich island of Greenland, decided to settle down there permanently. He established a farm and built a church, marking the beginning of a new chapter in his life. However, his old habits soon caught up with him. During a legal dispute, Erik lost his temper and struck a fellow settler over the head with a wooden stool, killing him instantly. Outraged by this heinous act, the local chieftain convened a legal assembly called the Althing, where Erik stood trial for murder. In the end, he was found guilty and banished from Greenland forever. Determined to start anew, Erik set sail westward, hoping to find another remote and uninhabited island to call home. To his dismay, he quickly encountered a group of Scottish monks, who informed him that the region was already inhabited. Defeated, Erik turned back, but as fate would have it, he was blown off course and washed ashore on the rugged coast of a land that would change history forever. Today, we know this land as Newfoundland, Canada, and the indigenous people as the Beothuk, but to Erik, it was a completely unknown territory. With limited supplies and no knowledge of the land, Erik knew he had to take swift and decisive action to survive. First, he and his men explored the coastline, searching for a suitable place to establish a settlement. Eventually, they found a shallow inlet with a small island nearby, which they named Helioland, or the Land of the Smooth Stones, due to its flat and rocky terrain. With a place to stay, Erik and his men set to work creating homes and fortifications to protect themselves from the elements and any potential threats from the native population. As they worked, they encountered members of the Beothuk tribe who had never seen white men before. At first, there was a great deal of curiosity and wonder on both sides. The Vikings marveled at the intricate tattoos and body piercings of the natives, while the Beothuk were equally fascinated by the Vikings' tall tales of adventure and exploration. However, this initial period of cultural exchange soon gave way to conflict. The Vikings, driven by their own needs and desires, began to encroach on the territory and resources of the Beothuk, leading to tensions and eventually open hostility. Despite these challenges, Erik managed to establish a small settlement and raise livestock, providing him and his men with a modest amount of sustenance. Still, he knew that for the sake of his people and their future, he needed to find a way to thrive in this new land, and so he did what any ambitious Viking would do. He set sail back to Iceland in search of more settlers and supplies. Unfortunately, Erik's second voyage to Greenland proved to be a disaster. His ship was lost in a storm, and he and his men were forced to wander the icy wilderness for months, enduring unimaginable hardship and suffering. Upon his eventual return to Greenland, Erik realized that he had been wrong. This new land was not the paradise he had imagined. The climate was too cold, the resources were scarce, and the constant threat of conflict with the natives made it impossible to feel truly safe. Despite the hardships, Erik pressed on, determined to make a life for himself and his people in this unforgiving land. He rebuilt his settlement and continued to trade with the natives, learning more about the land and its people. And it was through these interactions that Erik gained a deeper understanding of the challenges and opportunities that lay before him. As the years passed, Erik's settlement grew, becoming a hub of activity for explorers and traders from all over the known world. He became known as Erik the Red, a legendary figure whose name struck fear into the hearts of his enemies and inspired awe in those who heard his tales. But despite his success, Erik never forgot the hardships he and his people endured. He understood the importance of exploring and expanding their knowledge of the world, but he also knew that it came at a cost. And so he dedicated the rest of his life to finding a balance between the desire for exploration and the need for stability, laying the foundation for a new chapter in human history. We left off with Leif standing at the edge of the known world, preparing to sail west across the vast and unknown sea towards the setting sun. He had gathered together the best shipwrights in Greenland to prepare his fleet for this long voyage, and they had spent all winter working on the ships, lengthening them and strengthening them, making sure they would hold up against the crashing waves of the endless ocean. They had also recruited a hearty crew, men who were not afraid of the dark and lonely sea. They loaded their ships with food, water, furs, and other supplies, enough to last them many months on the open sea. When everything was ready, they held a great feast, inviting all the people of Greenland to come and see them off. They drank and sang and told stories of their adventures to come. When the time was right, they set sail and began their journey into the unknown. They sailed for days, weeks even, and no land appeared on the horizon. The men grew restless, but Leif stayed calm. He knew that they must keep going if they wanted to reach their destination. He had studied the stars and the sun, and he knew that they were heading in the right direction. But he could not have known how close they were to land, for there are places so remote that they are closer to Greenland than to each other. But let us not get ahead of ourselves. For now, let us return to our story. The first thing that happened to them was that they ran out of water, and since there was no land in sight, they were forced to resort to drinking salt water. But luckily, after some time, the rain began to fall and they collected it in barrels and casks to drink. Then one day, the men saw something in the distance. At first it looked like just another wave, but then it became clear that it was an island. They steered towards it, and when they landed, they found a place of great beauty. There were tall mountains and deep fjords, and the forests were filled with strange and wonderful animals. They named this place Helioland, or the Land of Stones. But today we know that this was most likely the island of Baffin in Canada. They stayed there for a while, hunting and fishing and exploring, but soon they set sail again and headed further west. The journey was long and hard, and many of the men became sick and tired of the endless sea. But still, they kept going until one day they saw another land. This one was different from the last. The mountains were lower and the trees were smaller, but what caught their attention was the large number of white sand beaches. They named this place Markland, or the Land of Sand, but today we know that this was most likely the coast of Labrador in Canada. Again, they stayed for a while, hunting and fishing and exploring, but soon they set sail again and headed further west. By now, the men were exhausted and many wanted to turn back. But Leif told them to keep going, that they were almost there. Finally, after many months at sea, they saw another land. It was like nothing they had ever seen before. The grass was green and the trees were full of berries and the air was filled with the smell of flowers. They named this place Vinland, or the Land of the Wild Vines. But today we know that this was most likely the coast of Newfoundland in Canada. And thus, the Vikings had discovered the North American continent more than 500 years before Christopher Columbus. Now, I know what you're thinking. If these guys discovered America so long ago, why do we celebrate Columbus Day? Well, that's because Columbus was the first European to reach the Americas since the Vikings, and he opened up the Americas to exploration and colonization by Europeans. But that's a story for another time. Let's finish this one first. After discovering Vinland, the Vikings explored the coast and found many wonderful things. There were huge whales and enormous herds of reindeer and no people at all. They stayed there for a while, hunting and fishing and gathering berries and wood. They built themselves houses and made themselves comfortable. They loved the land so much that they decided to stay there for the winter. But soon, fierce storms came and they were blown away from their homes. Many of the Vikings died, and those who lived were afraid to go outside. They were afraid that the same thing would happen to them, so they stayed inside their houses and waited for spring. When the sun finally returned, they went outside and began to repair their homes. But it was too late. A great windstorm came and destroyed their houses. They were forced to flee to the mountains. Leif stayed behind to try to save what he could. He got in his boat and went out to sea. But as he rowed away from the shore, he felt a sudden pain in his foot. He pulled up his shoe to find that he had stepped on a sharp stone and cut himself. Blood was pouring out of the wound, and he knew that he would die. He sat down in the boat and closed his eyes and thought of his home. Then he cried out, "O Thor, take my soul and do with it what you will." And as he said that, the pain went away and he felt himself being lifted up. He opened his eyes and looked around, but he saw nothing. Then he heard a voice that said, "Rise up, Leif, and go to the mountain called Hfelsea, where you will find your reward." And with that, he was healed. He returned to the others and told them what had happened. They decided to leave the island and never return. They put all their belongings in their boats and set sail for home, but soon the wind shifted and they were blown off course. Some ended up in Greenland and others in Norway. Leif, however, was blown to a desert island. He landed on the beach and looked around. He saw tall mountains and deep valleys and clear streams and wild animals, but he was thirsty and needed water, so he walked inland to look for it. As he walked, he saw a river in the distance and ran towards it, but when he got there, he saw that it was frozen. He was very sad, but then he saw a cave nearby and went inside. In the cave, he saw a man sitting on a stone. The man was old and grey and had a long beard. Leif asked him for water, but the man only shook his head and pointed to the river. Leif went back to the river and looked at the ice and thought of how he could melt it. Then he remembered the cave and the old man and went back there. He asked the man if he could chop the ice, but the man only shook his head and pointed to a ring on his finger. Leif asked what the ring meant, and the man said it meant power over the elements. Then he took off the ring and gave it to Leif, and with that, Leif could control the weather. He melted the ice and drank the water and gave some to the old man. Then he asked the man for a wife, and the man said, "You are worthy, but you must earn it." And with that, he disappeared. Leif searched for him, but could not find him. Then he went back to the river and saw a beautiful woman there. She was young and pretty and had long flowing hair. He talked to her and she agreed to be his wife. Then they went to live together in a cave by the river. They had 3 sons, and Leif named them after the 3 sons of Nor, Thor, Vali, and Tryggvi. He stayed on the island for many years, ruling over it and having many adventures. But eventually he missed his homeland and decided to return. He built himself a boat and set sail for Norway. When he arrived, he was welcomed as a hero. People came from all over to hear his tales of adventure, and he lived out the rest of his days in peace and happiness. Alright folks, that's the end of chapter 6. How did you like it? Which part was your favorite? Let me know in the comments below. Also, if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. Until next time, farewell. In order to make these videos, I read tons of books and research papers, and watched countless videos. It takes a lot of time and effort to sift through all that information and make it into a coherent and engaging story. But I love doing it because I love sharing my passion for history with others. That's why I started this channel. But now I want to do something even bigger and better. I want to make a feature-length documentary about the Vikings. I've already done a treatment and written a detailed outline. I know what the sections will be and roughly what the structure of each section will be. I'm planning to release it for free on this platform. And with your support, I can hire a team to help me produce it. I have a page that describes what I'm doing and how you can support me. In today's episode, we are going to continue our saga through the island arc, and we will do Chapter 7, Vinland. You can find more information below if you want to read the chapter for yourself, and here is some music to get us into the mood. As we begin this chapter, we're leaving behind the harsh conditions that Leif found himself in over the course of the previous 2 chapters, specifically Chapter 6, which has him stuck at sea for months in a big storm. But now he is here in this place called Vinland, and it's a much more hospitable environment. It says, there they saw the most beautiful river that ever flowed into the sea. It was just below the mountain and ran straight out between high mountains. Its current was so swift that no one could swim against it. This is just like a classic Norse description of the landscape that we see repeated again and again. You know, they love their rivers and mountains and waterfalls and fjords, all these things, so that's kind of what we're getting here. But there's also other evidence of life in this place. We see that, on each side of the river were level fields full of all kinds of grain and grass, as in summer meadows in Norway, only far better. Good was the land here and easy to till, and fields were everywhere. Now, that's an interesting description because it tells me that this is not a land that's inhabited by people. If it's just wild grass and grain growing, then clearly nobody's taking care of this, so this would be a land ripe for the taking, a land that they could settle. The men go on to explore this area and they come upon even more wonders. They find grapes, a great deal of wild grape-bearing vines, it says, and the grapes were large and sweet, and it says that they feasted on them to such an extent that some had no wish to return to Norway. That sounds kind of funny, but it's actually a serious point. There's really 2 ways to think about this. One is that the grapes may have been a little fermented and they got drunk and they didn't want to leave. Or secondly, this could actually be a symbolic way of describing how amazing the land was, that it was so good that it made you never want to leave. Leif and his men went back to the ships and sailed around the coast looking for a place to build a settlement. And they finally came upon a wide bay with a good harbor, where they thought they should settle. They started to set up camp and built themselves houses, and there was still plenty of summer left to enjoy the land. So they went out hunting and got much game and great store of fish. The text also tells us that the river that they had seen was not very far away. So it was a quick trip for them to go over and hunt, fish, and gather food. We're told that they lived there peacefully during the summer. They explored the rivers and hunted animals like moose and reindeer. There were no people living in the area, although it does say that once they did meet some, but they seem to have been peaceful. And when autumn arrived, they gathered building materials and prepared for winter. The chapter ends with the line, all in all, this was the best of lands that ever any of the Northmen had heard of or imagined. That's quite a statement, so let's pause for a moment and reflect on what this place might have been. Clearly, it's some sort of temperate climate. It's not frozen solid. There's rivers and lakes and streams and trees. The description makes it sound like there's lots of forests. There's wild grapes, there's grass and grain. There's moose and reindeer. All of this suggests to me that we're somewhere in the northeast of North America, perhaps in Newfoundland. The most famous place associated with Norse exploration in North America is El Anso Meadows in Newfoundland. There is archaeological evidence there of a Norse settlement, and it fits nicely with the descriptions in the sagas. I want to note that the word Vinland probably doesn't mean exactly the same thing as the word Vinland in the sagas. It refers to this particular place that they settled. But later on, the word Vinland seems to refer to a much larger area in general. Later texts talk about the whole region being called Scandinavia, after King Sweyn Asfellsson, who according to legend sent an expedition to explore the coast further. But this term seems to disappear after a while and then re-emerges later on in Icelandic sagas. By the time we get to the saga literature, it's referring to a huge area that stretches all the way down to the southern tip of Greenland, so it probably isn't quite accurate to translate the word Vinland as simply meaning Greenland, despite what you may hear. So now that we've heard the description of Vineland and its many wonders, what exactly was it called by the Norse people? The answer is Vinland, which literally means land of the grapes. The name comes from the Old Norse word meaning wine, and land, meaning land. When the Norse explorers first encountered the wild grapes on their journey, they named the territory Vineland in recognition of the abundance of this exotic fruit. As it turns out, the name Vineland is also the title of a paper published in 1965 by Canadian archaeologist Gerald Thomas about his explorations in the Lonso Meadows site, and it's a fascinating read. You can find more information below if you're interested. Now let's talk a little bit about the writing style for a moment. You may have noticed that in this chapter, as well as the last one, the descriptions of the landscape are almost hypnotic. There's something dreamlike about them. Remember, this story is supposed to be about the adventures of Leif Erikson, but the focus is not on Leif. He's basically absent throughout this chapter. Instead, the story focuses on the land itself and its ability to captivate those who encounter it. This brings us back to the idea that was introduced in chapter 4, the idea that the land has a certain power or magic to it. Remember how it was said that the land had a certain power over those who came to it, whether they wanted to stay or not? Well, this is even more explicit in chapter 7. The land is described as having a dreamlike quality to it. The narrator says, all in all, this was the best of lands that ever any of the Northmen had heard of or imagined. And the very fact that the men settled there shows that they yielded to the dreamlike quality of the land, so to speak. They gave themselves over to the experience of this magical place. This is what makes this story different from your typical Norse saga, which usually follows the exploits of a legendary hero. Here, the land itself is the star of the show. It is presented as a kind of character in the story, almost like a mythical being. This is made even more clear when we consider the use of kennings and the poetic language used throughout the chapter. Kennings are a common feature of Old Norse poetry, and they are basically just a fancy way of saying something. For example, in chapter 6, Leif is referred to as a shipfarer. This is a kenning for sailor or traveler. You get the idea. Here's another example. The narrator says, when autumn arrived, they gathered building materials and prepared for winter. What does the phrase, gathered building materials, remind you of? Probably of trees, right? Like you cut down trees to build stuff. But in the Old Norse language, the word for tree is saha, and the word for building material is ham. So instead of saying gathered building materials, the author could say gathered sahaham, which literally means gathered tree building material. But obviously it's kind of redundant. It's extra words. So in Old Norse poetry, you would combine these two words together and make a kenning. So instead of saying gathered building materials, they would say sahaham. So now you get this nice poetic expression. And that's just one example. There's lots of other kennings used throughout this chapter. Here's one more. They went out hunting and got much game. The word for hunter in Old Norse is huntsman. So huntsman good, it's a kenning for hunter. But notice how this kenning works on two levels. On the surface, it just means hunter, but on a deeper level, it can also mean brave, adventurous, free-spirited, because obviously a hunter is someone who's willing to go out into the world and face the dangers of the wild. If you'd like to learn more about kennings, feel free to check out my lecture. Thanks for watching. Bye. The previous episodes are available for patrons. This is chapter 8, where we meet some people for the first time. After sailing west from the British Isles, Erik the Red reached an island that he called Stryma, which may have been the same island that later became known as El Hierro in the Canary Islands. It was here that he left his friend and fellow Icelander, Floke, to die of starvation. When he returned from exploring the island and found that Floke had slaughtered all their livestock and refused to share the meat. But this story appears only in one manuscript, so it's either an invention by the sagas to make Erik look good, or a complete fabrication by Snorri Sturluson to embarrass his rival, Sturla Sebitsen. Let's just say that I take it with a grain of salt and move on. Instead, let's focus on what happens next, which is told in multiple manuscripts. Erik sailed further west into an area full of islands and possibly archipelagos that were even larger than Iceland. He landed at a place he named Markland, which likely refers to a forested area, perhaps Labrador or Newfoundland. And there he encountered the Skrylings, who are generally believed to be the indigenous peoples of North America. Now we don't know exactly how long he stayed because the manuscript says for 3 years, but that could mean summers only or something else entirely. What we do know is that during his stay he built a longhouse and spent winters there. This tells me two things. First, he didn't sail back to Iceland during the winter, which means that he may have thought the land might be habitable. Second, the fact that he spent several winters there suggests that he actually made it through the winter alive. So maybe the land was habitable after all. And while he was there, he had moments of curiosity. Like when he sent a boy ashore to collect firewood and the boy came back with an axe made out of a deer's leg bone, or when he caught a fish weighing 42 pounds, which is almost 20 kilos, and the Skrillingas thought it was a miracle. But not everything was so friendly. One day, Erik and two of his men went hunting, and they noticed tracks made by humans in the soft earth. So they followed them and came upon a village. As they were looking around, one of the men picked up a stone to throw at a building and smashed the window, and the other two begged him not to do it. They wanted to avoid war with the Skrillingas if possible, but the impatient man threw the stone and broke the window anyway. Now, in most versions of the saga, Erik tried to sneak away after that, but in one version he stays behind to face the consequences. Either way, a large group of Skrallings surrounded them, and Erik pulled his axe to defend himself. When the Skrallings saw this, they thought he was going to throw the axe at them, so they ran away. Erik and his men left the area soon after. In another story, Erik was fishing with a hook made of iron and a line made of flax, and when a Skralling saw this, he asked what they were doing. When Erik said he was fishing, the Skralling was amazed by the iron hook, and when Erik asked for one of his arrows back, the Skralling wouldn't give it unless Erik gave him an axe in return, and Erik agreed. Over time, the Norsemen traded with the Skrillingas and got access to much better tools made of iron ore that the Skrillingas mined themselves. And the Norsemen also learned about agriculture from them. In particular, they learned how to grow barley. But the trouble was that while the Skrallings were curious about the Norsemen, they were very suspicious of them. At first, they didn't even trust the Norsemen enough to trade with them. Instead, they would put their goods down and walk away, and then the Norsemen would take the goods and walk away. Then the next time they met, the Skrillingas would put their goods down and run away, and the Norsemen would do the same. Eventually, they started leaving their goods overnight. And then finally they were willing to actually talk to the Norsemen. But as we can see, the peace didn't last long. The Norsemen and the Skrillingas fought many battles over the course of several years, and the Norsemen suffered many losses, especially in one battle where Erik and his brother Rolf were captured by the Skrillingas and forced to play a deadly game. In this game, the Norsemen were tied up and placed inside a fence, and then the Skrallings sent women out to cut off the heads of the Norsemen. Now, luckily, one of the Skrallings' axes broke, and when the chief saw this, he thought it was a bad omen, so he stopped the game and untied the Norsemen. Erik and his brother immediately grabbed the broken axe and attacked the Skralling who had untied them, and they killed him. They also killed the chief, and the rest of the Skrallingers fled. It seems that Erik and his men weren't popular with the locals, but they couldn't stay in the area. Why? I think it's because there were simply too many Skrallings. There were villages everywhere, and they vastly outnumbered the Norsemen. In addition, the Skrallings were fierce warriors who were able to inflict serious casualties on the Norsemen. Even though the Norsemen were bigger and stronger, they also had bigger weaknesses. For example, they relied on boats for transportation. So if the Skrallings could destroy those boats, the Norsemen would be trapped. Also, the Norsemen relied on livestock for food, but the Skrallings could kill those animals or steal them. They could also damage or destroy any buildings the Norsemen constructed, such as their longhouses. If the Norsemen wanted to stay in Markland, they would have to build permanent structures like houses and farms, and they also needed more people. Otherwise they couldn't defend themselves against the attacks of the Skrillingas. But there was a problem with that. The Norsemen considered the Skrillingas to be heathens because they didn't worship the same gods as the Norsemen, and most Norsemen probably thought that heathens weren't real people in the same way that they were. For example, in the Orkneyinga saga, which takes place a century earlier, a character named Kveldulf killed a heathen while he was praying, and the author wrote that he didn't commit a sin by killing him. After all, he wasn't a human being, so it's unlikely that the Norsemen would want to live among people whom they considered non-human. And unfortunately, things got worse before they got better. In one story, a Norse boat arrived in Markland carrying many men, women, and children. The Norsemen went ashore and celebrated with the Skrallings, drinking fermented mare's milk and playing games. Then they slept until noon the next day. When they awoke, they saw that the Skrallings had disappeared and all their boats were destroyed except one, and that boat was filled with the bodies of the Norsemen's wives and children. The Norsemen were furious and chased the Skrallings, but they couldn't catch up to them. It seems clear to me that the Norsemen couldn't sustain peaceful relations with the Skrellings. Their cultures were too different. They couldn't understand each other's religious practices, and the Skrellings simply had too many warriors. If one group attacked, the other would suffer heavy casualties, and in the end, it would be impossible to defend all the settlements against those attacks. So Erik and the other Norsemen decided to leave and never come back. They settled instead in Greenland, which was easier to reach and more isolated from other people. And the Norse view of Vinland was forever tarnished by the memory of the Skrellings. In fact, Snorri Sturluson said that the memory of the Skrellings caused all the misfortunes in Vinland, and that's why the Norsemen abandoned it. But wait, hold on, maybe I missed something. Did you spot anything that I didn't mention? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Also, I am preparing an interview with Dr. Megan Kelly about the archaeological evidence for Norse contact with the Americas. This will be the second episode of my podcast, The History of the Vikings. If you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting me on Patreon or Ko-fi. Thanks to my supporters for making these videos possible. Thanks for watching. In Chapter 8, we followed Leif Erikson as he explored the American coast, sailing into what we today call Canada, the United States, and even possibly Mexico. But where did he go when his 3-year voyage was complete? What happened next? And how did he die? Today we'll explore those questions and more, in Chapter 9, Return to Greenland. Leif stood at the prow of his ship, watching the coastline recede into the mists of the North Atlantic. After 3 years in Vinland, it was time to return home. He had discovered new lands teeming with resources and with enough fresh water to sustain a settlement or many settlements. There were also plenty of native people to trade with, or perhaps even enslave. His head was filled with visions of wealth and glory for himself and his father, Erik the Red, who would no doubt be very proud of his son's exploits. But just as the land rose out of the sea, so too did a huge wave of doubt and uncertainty engulf Leif. For all its promise, Vinland was a hard country. The forests were thick and the soil poor. The natives were warlike and unforgiving. Even the climate, while mild by northern standards, could turn bitterly cold and stormy without warning. Was it worth returning to this place? The answer came to him as surely as the sun rising over the waves, as certainly as the wind filling the sails of his ship. He would go back, but he would go back alone. First, though, he had news to deliver. The first sighting was Greenland. When Leif reached the familiar ice-wreathed shores of his homeland, he made landfall at a place called Disparition, probably near the southern tip of the island of Disco. This was a small fishing settlement, so he left the ship there under the care of a few of his crew and walked ashore to break his journey. News of the discovery of new lands spread like wildfire, and when Erik, the Red, heard of his son's exploits, he was so overcome with joy that he picked up the boy and walked around the village in procession, shouting for all to hear, "My son is a true hero. May Greenland's good fortune begin with him." From there they sailed north to the biggest town in Greenland, Gartry, ruled by Erik the Red's half-brother, a man known only as Thorgils, who ruled like a god over his people. But it was not long before the stench of power, greed, and ambition wafted over the harbor. Thorgils would not allow Leif to share his discoveries for fear that the town's ruler would steal his thunder. So the two men set sail again, this time for the remote northern settlement of Eriksfjord, where their own farm was located. It was here, in the relative peace and quiet of their own lands, that Leif recounted his adventures to his father. But Erik the Red was not the man he once was. Now old and sick, he lay in bed, his eyesight failing. All the blood feuds and murders he committed in his younger days had caught up with him, and now he feared the end of his life was nigh. He told Leif to keep the secret of Vinland from everyone, especially Thorgils, until his death. In fact, he wanted the entire saga of Vinland kept secret for 10 years, until a Christian bishop visited Greenland. Then and only then should the knowledge of the newfound lands be revealed. It was a strange request, but one Leif promised to honor, so the saga of Vinland, which must have been recounted and embellished around firesides for generations, was locked away, hidden like a precious jewel in the chest of history. At least, that's one version of events. History, however, is never straightforward, and the story of Leif and Vinland is no exception. Let me explain. The earliest written account of these events comes to us from the Icelandic writer Snorri Sturluson, who wrote the Edda in the 13th century. This work is an invaluable source for our understanding of Norse culture and mythology. But Snorri was writing long after Leif's exploits, and it's possible that some details got lost or changed in the retelling. For instance, we don't know if Thor was actually a tyrant, although he almost certainly wasn't a saint. Historians think he may have acted out of genuine concern for the well-being of his people, believing he could best protect them by keeping news of Vinland secret. Perhaps he planned to lead an expedition himself and was worried that others would plunder the resources of Vinland before he had the chance. Whatever the truth, Thorgils didn't get the chance to find out because he died soon after meeting Leif. The exact circumstances are unknown, but it's believed he was murdered, although strangely, no one was ever held accountable. Erik the Red, on the other hand, did make it another 5 years, dying sometime between 962 and 965. But it is not certain if he died knowing that the secret of Vinland was safe. That's because Leif didn't wait until Bishop Adam of the Western Isles visited Greenland, breaking his father's last wish. According to the Orkneyinga saga, another Icelandic text, Leif traveled to Norway to tell King Harald Bluetooth about Vinland, asking him to help conquer this new land, but Harald was having none of it. In fact, he didn't believe a word of it. He accused Leif of lying and ordered him thrown into prison. Fortunately, one of the king's advisors spoke up for Leif, vouching for his honesty. He agreed to take Leif's case to the King of Denmark, a man named Sweyn Fjabard. While waiting for the appeal to be heard, Leif took a job as a hired fighter in the Danish army, but this too ended badly. During a battle against the Anglo-Saxons, Leif was captured and sold into slavery. After enduring terrible mistreatment, he managed to escape and make his way to the court of Sweyn Fjabard, where his tale of Vinland finally got its hearing. The king was impressed, but still wary. He insisted that Leif swear an oath on a sacred relic called the Black Stone, promising not to lie about Vinland's location. Only then did Sweyn send a fleet to find the new lands. This may seem like a convenient way to round out our story, but the problem is that the stories contradict each other. Which one is correct? It's impossible to say. Perhaps Erik the Red's wish was honored and the saga remained secret for 10 years. Maybe Thorgils was the bad guy we think he was. Or maybe he was a reluctant hero trying to protect his people. Perhaps Leif truly did wait for Bishop Adam, who visited Greenland in 965. Or maybe he was impatient and went to Norway where he was imprisoned. We simply don't know. But there's no need to worry, because no matter the path Leif took, it doesn't change the outcome. Because whether the story was kept secret or bled across the kingdoms of Europe, the end result was the same. Leif Erikson changed history. The secret was out and there was no putting it back in the bottle. No sooner had news of Vinland reached the eager ears of European nobility than the rush was on to claim these rich lands for themselves. We can imagine Erik the Red looking down from the halls of Valhalla, a wry smile on his face and a tankard of mead in his hand, pleased as punch that he'd given the kings and nobles of Europe something to fight over. And yet, as the armies and settlers descended on Vinland, killing, stealing, and conquering, Erik's other wish, that the country would be known as Vinland, also came true. But what happened to Leif? As the wars in Vinland intensified and whole fleets of ships headed across the sea, Leif disappeared from the historical record. He doesn't appear in the sagas or any other contemporary accounts, yet he's still remembered in some texts as a great leader and warrior, a man of the people who fought to free them from the oppression of kings and bishops. According to these stories, he became the leader of Greenland after Erik the Red's death, and led his people through times of prosperity and peace. Others remembered him as a Christian missionary who preached the word of God throughout the north. Still others claimed that he died in Vinland, either killed in battle with the natives or lost at sea. Which Leif was the real Leif? Once again, there are no records to help us sift through the legend, to decide what parts of Leif's life are rooted in reality and which are pure fantasy. In the end, all we can do is look at the totality of the tales and try to understand the kind of man whose deeds inspired such stories. A man who braved the unknown and returned with the promise of untold riches and wonders. A man who led his people through hard times and showed them the way to the Lord. A man who explored the edge of the world and lived to tell the tale. Thank you for joining us for this series on the discovery of America. If you enjoyed this show, check out my podcast, where I bring you new episodes every week on the ancient world. Please remember to support us. Hey everyone, I'm here to talk about Chapter 10 of the wonderful book, Vinland, Saga of the Norse in North America by Julian Huxley. And in this chapter we are going to learn what happened after Leif Erikson left North America. We know that he didn't stay in Vinland, which is what the Norse called North America. He went back over to Greenland. Maybe he even made another trip over there. But it was his sister Thorvald who first went back to Vinland. So Leif came back to Greenland and lived out the remainder of his life there. And Thorvald, his full sister, set off for Vinland, Iceland, and Greenland. These were very close. This was part of the same seafaring culture. In fact, one might call them the same seafaring culture. They all knew each other really well. Many of these people had been to each other's lands many times. Anyway, Thorvald's fleet consisted of 20 ships, and they landed in the same place where Leif had landed, which we now know as Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland. So they had some success early on. They found a lot of building materials there. That's why when the fleet arrived, they saw all those huge piles of cedar wood and thought, wow, this is great, we can build houses like in the south, warm houses out of cedar wood. Unfortunately, just like Leif, Thorvald and his men quickly got into conflict with the local indigenous peoples, whom the Norse called Skrallings. It seems to have been a fight over land use and resources. The Norse wanted to build permanent settlements and use the land according to their way of using land, which was totally at odds with how the First Nations people used the land. And so they fought a major battle with the Skrallings. The Norse killed many of the Skrallings, but unfortunately, their victory was short-lived. You see, they had brought domesticated animals with them, sheep, cattle, and pigs, which quickly got loose and went wild. The sheep and pigs did especially well in this new environment, and so the Norse had to spend more and more time chasing down their pigs and sheep and bringing them back into the fold, if you will. It sounds almost comical today, but I imagine that must have been very frustrating for them. At the same time, they were probably getting low on supplies, because they had to survive on what they could forage and hunt. And so they were living pretty hard, not easy, hard lives. And so they decided to go back to Greenland and regroup. When Thorvald returned to Greenland, he told stories of the difficulties he had encountered in Vinland, specifically focusing on the Skrallings or the Native Americans, and he painted such a negative picture of Vinland that no one wanted to go there anymore. No one wanted to go to this faraway land of hardship and strife. So about 3 years later, Thorvald decided to give it another try. He set sail again for Vinland, but only 2 ships actually made it over. There is an interesting story about one of these ships. You see, one of the ships was blown off course and wound up on the shores of the island of Helgeland, which may have been Baffin Island. Now, when the men on this ship realized that they were not in Vinland, they actually turned back and went home. This is the only recorded instance of any Norse ship turning around on the way to Vinland. I wonder what they thought when they rounded that southern tip of Greenland and saw that endless expanse of the Atlantic stretching before them. What were they thinking? Did they feel like they were at the edge of the world? I don't know. But it's a fascinating piece of history nonetheless. Anyway, Thorvald established a base camp on the shore of a bay which the Norse called Clans. Thorvald decided that he would spend the winter here and then explore further in the spring. But when spring came, the weather was so terrible that the Norse couldn't go anywhere. They were trapped in their camp by storms, and so they spent the summer there as well. And during the long winter evenings, they heard tales of the outside world from a sailor named Thialvi, who had sailed around the world. The following spring, Thorvald and his men finally set out to explore, but they weren't gone long when a storm separated the ships. Thorvald found himself washed ashore on an island, and he named it Skur to remind him of home. When his men finally caught up with him, they decided to head south together, and they finally landed in Vinland. They found the place where Leif had built his house, and they started to rebuild it. However, once again, they got into conflicts with the Skrallings, and in the end, Thorvald was killed in battle. His men were unable to avenge his death because they were attacked while they were still mourning and had unsharpened their weapons. So they decided to abandon their Vinland settlement and head back to Greenland. It wasn't long after this that another expedition set out for Vinland, led by a man named Freydis, who was Thorvald's sister. Unfortunately, she had a difficult journey. There were a lot of storms. Many of her ships were wrecked, and many of her men were lost. But she made it to Vinland anyway, where she took over Thorvald's settlement. She too got into conflicts with the Skrallings. The Norse were able to defeat the Skrallings in battle, but Freydis was troubled by the violence. She wanted to leave it all behind and get out of Vinland. She also had some supernatural experiences which frightened her, so she sent 2 of her captains to go check out these things, but both captains disappeared without a trace. This obviously spooked her even more, and she fled Vinland. As a result of all these conflicts with the natives, the loss of many ships and men, and the general feeling that Vinland was cursed, the Norse abandoned their settlements in Vinland and went back to Greenland, and that is why, according to the Norse sagas, Vinland was eventually abandoned. But was it really? Well, the next question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we know that the Norse didn't continue to visit Vinland after this point? We do know that sporadic contacts continued between the Norse and the First Nations people along the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador for the next couple of 100 years. There are archaeological sites that suggest that Norse people continued to visit Vinland after the main settlements were abandoned. For example, there is the site of Point Rosy in Newfoundland. It shows evidence of a small camp that was occupied for a short period of time, around the year 1400, but we have no written records from the Norse confirming these visits. In fact, we have no written records of any kind confirming these visits, so we don't really know what to make of them. There are other theories about why Vinland was eventually abandoned. One theory is that the Norse simply forgot about Vinland. If we look at the sagas, we see that every single saga mentioning Vinland has a different cast of characters. The only character that appears in more than one saga is, of course, Leif Erikson. Each time the Norse went to Vinland, it was a totally new group of people, and so maybe after a few generations, the memory of Vinland faded away and they just didn't go back. Maybe they thought it was just a crazy dream. Another theory is that the Norse went back to Vinland, but they didn't tell anyone about it. Maybe they kept secret the fact that they had found a new land across the sea, because they wanted to exploit the resources of Vinland for themselves alone. The final theory is that Vinland was completely destroyed by the Skrallings, and that's why there are no more Norse settlements there. It is interesting to consider these theories, because we've already talked about evidence suggesting that the Norse were actually quite friendly with the First Nations people in Newfoundland. So it would be quite ironic if the First Nations people were the ones who destroyed the Norse settlements. Whatever the case, the Norse presence in North America eventually faded away until it practically disappeared altogether. And it wasn't until 500 years later that Europeans began to return to the shores of North America. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. Also be sure to check out my podcast where I interview experts on all kinds of topics related to history and prehistory. Thanks again for watching. Take care. Okay, so we talked a lot about how Leif Erikson supposedly discovered America about 500 years before Christopher Columbus. But let's be real here for a second. No one really knows if he did or didn't. There are the sagas that tell the story of his travels across the sea to a land which he named Vinland, but we have no physical evidence of it. So if the sagas are our only source for this story, then by all means we should consider it a myth. But that's not where the story ends. We know for a fact that Vikings lived in Greenland during the 8th to 11th centuries, and from there they did venture out on voyages into the North Atlantic. Because we also know that Vikings settled in Newfoundland, Canada around the year 1000. So there was definitely some truth to the story. How do we know any of this? Well, thanks to sagas, people actually kept the stories alive through oral tradition for centuries. Even though written records were scarce, stories of heroic deeds like those of Leif Erikson were kept alive through songs and poems. This is what eventually led to the sagas being written down between the 13th and 14th centuries. So even though we don't have any written records from the time period in question, the sagas are the next best thing. Another reason we know there is truth to the sagas is due to archaeological findings in the 19th and 20th centuries. In the mid-1960s, an archaeologist found a Norse-style brooch at Meadows, a large inlet located on the northern tip of Newfoundland. The following year, excavations revealed the remains of 8 buildings, including a forge workshop and longhall, as well as artifacts such as animal bones, remnants of a turf roof, weaving loom weights, spindle whorls, and a variety of other household items. All of this suggested that there had been a short-term settlement there by North Atlantic or Norse people. The archaeological site was given the name Meadows, which translates to the English Bay of the Meadows. It was added to the UNESCO World Heritage List in 1979, and today is known as a Viking archaeological site. It is believed that this was the location of Leif Erikson's settlement. So now we know without a shadow of a doubt that Vikings settled in Newfoundland around the year 1000, almost 500 years before Columbus arrived. So in modern history, we do have Leif Erikson to thank for opening up North America to European exploration and colonization. And to commemorate this, the United States even celebrates Leif Erikson Day every October. So let's take a look at how this holiday came to be. In the United States, Leif Erikson Day is celebrated on the 3rd Monday of October. As of right now, only 6 states observe this holiday, but many more recognize it as a cultural event. Those states are Connecticut, Maine, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wisconsin. Of these, only Minnesota has made it an official state holiday. Despite the date, historians say the first celebration of Leif Erikson Day was held on October 9, 1825 in Philadelphia. organized by a group of Scandinavians who wanted to show their support for the cultural roots. This was long before there was talk of the United States needing a separate holiday dedicated to Columbus. Throughout the following decades, celebrations continued to be held in various locations across the US, usually coinciding with Norwegian Constitution Day on May. But it was NT until 1927 that the Society of Explorers and Colonists proposed celebrating Leif Erikson Day on the third Monday of October. They requested that President Calvin Coolidge issue a proclamation for the day, but he declined, because he felt that it would be inappropriate to set aside a day to celebrate an explorer whose existence was still debated by historians. It wasn't until 1964 that President Lyndon B. Johnson proclaimed October as Leif Erikson Day. He proclaimed the day as one for Americans to rededicate themselves to the ideals of adventure, discovery, and the pioneering heritage. So even the president back then knew that Leif's existence wasn't a sure thing, but that didn't stop him from celebrating the idea of the Norse explorer anyway. In the proclamation, President Johnson said, "Here at the midpoint of our age of space, when man's destiny is written among the stars, it is fitting that we recall the saga of the first European explorers to cross the endless seas and set foot on the shores of the New World. Nearly 1,000 years ago, men of Norse blood sailed boldly across the unknown oceans and established a permanent settlement in Newfoundland, Canada, thus proving that the spirit of adventure and discovery is not confined to any one people or any one time." President Johnson could very well have been talking about the space race that was going on at the time, during the 1950s and 60s. The Soviet Union and the United States took turns, topping each other's achievements with increasingly daring feats of space exploration, like launching the first satellite into space or sending the first human. These events spurred on an interest in science, technology, and exploration that swept through the nation. President Johnson himself played a key role in launching NASA and setting the goals of landing astronauts on the moon. So his admiration for exploration and adventurers was clearly genuine. The timing of this holiday is interesting because the US was already celebrating Columbus Day on the second Monday of October, but while everyone was focusing on the Italian explorer, historians were coming to the realization that he wasn't exactly the first European to explore the Americas. At the time, this new information was becoming widely available to the public, and so the timing of establishing a separate holiday for Leif was perfect. A few years after Johnson's proclamation, in 1967, the U.S. Congress passed a law designating the third Monday of October as Leif Erikson Day, and since then, states have been able to decide whether or not to observe it as a holiday or cultural event. So why is it important to celebrate Leif Erikson? Today, we celebrate Leif Erikson as a symbol of exploration and courage. His story inspires us to push beyond our perceived limits and discover new possibilities, both in our personal lives and in the world around us. Furthermore, it shows how the United States was not solely built by people of British or French descent, but also by settlers from Scandinavia. Many of them weren't even technically Vikings, but rather their descendants who chose to settle in North America permanently. And finally, this holiday gives us the opportunity to learn more about the rich history and culture of the Norse people and their contributions to our world. We can also reflect on the importance of cultural diversity and inclusion and the ways in which different cultures have shaped our nation. I think the creation of this holiday was also a way to distance itself from Columbus and the violence done to Indigenous people during his era and after. Obviously, this isn't what the holiday is explicitly about, but the intention behind creating a separate holiday for Leif speaks volumes. When you think about it, it makes sense to look at figures from the past through the lens of today's society, because the people from back then obviously had very different values and morals than we do today. And that's something to keep in mind when we talk about historical figures like Leif Erikson. He was a man who lived nearly 1,000 years ago, and we have no concrete proof that he ever set foot in North America. But that doesn't change the fact that Vikings explored and settled parts of North America almost 500 years before Columbus arrived. And that's where we'll end this chapter. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please leave me a like and a comment down below. I always appreciate hearing your thoughts, but as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye. Hey there, welcome to this channel. Today we are going to do something just a little different. We're going to talk about Chapter 12. This has been a saga spanning multiple videos and even multiple playlists. So if you feel lost, don't worry, because I do have a playlist for you. But before we go into that, I need to know, did you like this series? Is it something you would like more of? Let me know in the comments. And now let's dive right into this crazy journey through time. Oh, and I also want to say happy birthday to one of my patrons who was born on the exact same day as our boy Leif. If you want to shout out on your birthday or any other day, then consider supporting us because every little bit helps keep the dream alive. And yes, we do have some pretty cool perks, but being recognized in this segment is definitely one of the best. Now back to the show. Time for a summary. We've been over this story many times before, but maybe with all the details we missed some important ones. So let's try and get this all together. Iceland was doing Iceland stuff. It was a Viking settlement with all the hallmarks of that culture. They had their own government, their own laws and chieftains, longboats, and a general disdain for Christianity. That last part really chapped the ass of a missionary named Thangbrand, who decided to take matters into his own hands by stealing Leif Erikson's sister and holding her hostage on a nearby island unless he converted. Now, Leif wasn't having that, so he got the help of a couple friends and took Thangbrand back to Iceland, where they threw him in a pit. Yeah, you heard me right, a pit. No execution for this guy, just a whole pit. And if that sounds cruel, it's because it was. The people of Iceland were generally anti-Christian at this point. They would later come around, but not without a lot of convincing. Leif himself had gone exploring and discovered a land he called Vinland, which is likely North America, specifically the area around Newfoundland. He brought this knowledge back with him and told everyone about it. Unfortunately, no one believed him, which was actually kind of a common problem. People didn't believe explorers very often, even when they had proof. One example was Pythias, who had sailed to the southernmost tip of Africa and came back with exotic plants and animals, and yet nobody believed him when he told them the earth was round. Of course, the Greek philosophers had already proved this long ago, but the idea hadn't caught on with the broader populace. Anyway, getting back to Leif, he tried again with the whole telling people about Vinland thing, but once again fell on deaf ears, and he was frustrated, because he knew what he had seen and wanted others to experience it for themselves. He eventually gave up on convincing his fellow Icelanders, but still wanted to go back to Vinland, so he called up his buddy Tyrubar Torvaldsson and invited him along. The two set sail for the west, but bad weather forced them to turn back. When they got to Iceland, they learned that King Olaf Tryggvason had outlawed human sacrifice and other pagan practices. In response to this, Thorvald decided to run away and become a Muslim. Yeah, I know, weird, right? Who becomes Muslim because someone outlawed human sacrifice? Well, apparently Thorvald was really into human sacrifice, so much so that when he arrived in Greenland, he was arrested for killing 2 Christian missionaries who had come to convert him. To be fair, it doesn't seem like he was trying to convert anyone. He was just being a total jerk. Meanwhile, Leif had finally convinced some people to go with him to Vinland, but not before he promised to make them all chiefs in his new settlement. Everyone set sail, but a violent storm knocked Leif off his boat and onto an island. He survived though and met some friendly natives who took care of him until he was well enough to travel. Then he set off again, this time with only 2 ships following him. Eventually reaching the coast of North America, they built a fort and tried to settle down. Unfortunately, the locals didn't love the idea of outsiders squatting on their land, so they attacked. Realizing that they were outmatched, the Norsemen fled back to their boats and set sail for home. Leif, however, stayed behind, possibly because he had fallen in love with a local woman. He either stayed with her or was taken captive, because he never returned to Norway, according to the sagas. But wait, we aren't done yet. I almost forgot to tell you about his son, who was born in Vinland and therefore makes him the first European child born in the Americas. His name was Snorri Thorbergsson, and he was considered a great hero in Greenlander lore. That's right, not only did Leif discover Vinland, he helped establish a settlement and have a kid. But despite all this, he is hardly remembered. Most people don't even know he existed, let alone anything about his accomplishments. Part of this is because most people don't read the sagas, but another reason is that Snorri's father is the big name in this story, and I don't blame him. Leif Erikson is a household name in some circles, and rightfully so. But let's take a step back and think about his accomplishments. First of all, he explored and made it to the Americas nearly 500 years before Christopher Columbus. Second, he had a kid there, making him the ancestor of every single person of Norwegian descent in the Americas. Third, he was a Viking, and no matter how much you might think Vikings were horrible, let's face it, they were explorers, traders, farmers, all kinds of things besides pillagers. But what I want to focus on is his courage. All these accomplishments required bravery and determination, but he did it for the sake of curiosity. He wasn't motivated by greed or godliness. He just wanted to see what was out there. And in the process, he changed the world. Let's think about that for a second. If it weren't for the actions of one curious man, the entire future of the Americas could have been completely different. Maybe the natives would have discovered Europe before we did the New World, or perhaps the Spanish would have claimed all of North America. The point is, we will never know what would have happened, but we can be pretty sure it wouldn't be the same. So why do we celebrate Leif Erikson Day today? Well, for the same reason we celebrate it back in 999 AD, as a way to commemorate those brave enough to explore the unknown. To those who go into the vast darkness of space or cross oceans in search of new lands or knowledge. We honor those who seek out what lies beyond, whether they find gold or glory. Leif Erikson reminds us that the greatest discoveries are made by those who dare to venture forth into the unknown. And now closing with a gentle reflection on Leif Erikson's journey. The sound of the waves crashing against the hull of his ship echoes through the ages, a timeless lullaby that speaks of adventure and discovery. Just as Leif Erikson braved the tumultuous seas to uncover new horizons, may we to find the courage to navigate the uncharted waters of our own lives. The northern lights dance across the night sky, a celestial tapestry of wonder and mystery. They served as a guiding light for Leif and his crew, offering solace and hope when the darkness threatened to consume them. May we find inspiration in their ethereal glow, embracing the beauty of the unknown and the magic that unfolds when we dare to follow our dreams, like the sagas of old. The tale of Leif Erikson and his discovery of Vinland has echoed through the centuries, inspiring awe and wonder in those who hear it. May his legacy continue to live on, reminding us that the spirit of exploration and discovery is truly the greatest adventure of all. And with that, we bring this chapter to a close, allowing the whispers of the sea to lull us into a peaceful slumber. Sweet dreams.